From Chicago studios, this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum. I'm Samana, Siddiqui. Our top story tonight is about the mask requirement in the U.S. The United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, on Tuesday changed its COVID-19 masking recommendations. It is now urging vaccinated people in certain areas of the country to resume wearing masks indoors in public areas to keep safe from the virus. The new policies are in response to ongoing concerns over COVID's Delta variant. The CDC has determined that vaccinated people can spread the virus to others. White House staff have again been told to wear masks as cases rise in the nation's capital. The CDC also recommends that all teachers, staff, students, and visitors to K-12 schools wear masks, regardless of vaccination status. President Joe Biden said he is considering mandatory vaccinations for 2 million federal workers. On Monday, the Veterans Affairs Department said it would require its frontline health workers, some 115,000 people, to get the shot. This would make it the first federal agency to institute the requirement. New York City has already started requiring vaccines or weekly COVID tests for hundreds of thousands of its workers. And in California, Governor Gavin Newsom declared a similar policy for state employees and healthcare workers. The U.S. Department of Justice says federal law does not bar businesses or agencies from mandating COVID vaccines. In the meantime, medical groups are calling for mandatory vaccination of all U.S. healthcare workers. And in related news, the CDC is advising Americans against travel to the United Kingdom, given the surge of cases over there. The U.S. Department of Justice says officials from former President Donald Trump's administration can testify to Congress about his role in the January 6 Capitol Hill attack. In a letter obtained by The Guardian, the Justice Department says they can also testify about the former president's efforts to subvert the results of the 2020 election. The move clears the path for other top former officials to also testify to congressional committees investigating the attack without fear of repercussions. In the meantime, some Republicans are calling the January 6 rioters political prisoners. 6 Republican members of the House marched on the Justice Department Tuesday afternoon. They were escorted by a man in a giant Trump costume, bearing the message, "Trump won." Representative Paul Gosar of Arizona proclaimed at a news conference outside the Department of Justice headquarters, "These are political prisoners who are now being persecuted and bearing the pain of unjust suffering." U.S. President Joe Biden told the intelligence community this week that his administration is getting us back to the basics. He also promised them that he will never politicize the work they do. Biden was addressing the Office of the Director of National Intelligence in McLean, Virginia. He asked the intelligence community to add members with significant scientific capacities relative to pathogens.
As we compete for the future of the 21st century, with China and other nations, we have to stay on top of the cutting-edge developments of science and technology. If you'd hold for a second here, I want to point out something. You know, we used to be, when I first got here as a U.S. Senator, actually 3.5 decades ago, we invested more money, R&D, money in R&D as a percent of our GDP than any nation in the world. We're now number 8.
Starting August 16th, Walmart will be covering 100% of its college student employees' tuition and fees. The corporate giant has 1.5 million full-time and part-time employees. Walmart's program for college students is accessible through 10 designated schools. The world's largest retailer's minimum wage, however, remains at $11 an hour. That is less than the $15 per hour offered by Amazon and Target as a starting rate. A U.S. senator is calling on President Joe Biden to find out whether Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were involved in Tunisia's dismissal of democracy. Senator Chris Murphy said the Biden administration must immediately determine whether the 2 Gulf countries played a role in the political turmoil erupting in Tunisia. Tunisian President Kais Saied ousted Prime Minister Hisham Meshishi and suspended the legislature for 30 days on Sunday. This was followed by street clashes on Monday outside the army-barricaded parliament. The president, who under Tunisia's constitution controls the armed forces, warned his opponents against taking up arms. He also threatened them with violence if they opposed him. Since Saied was elected in 2019, he has been locked in a showdown with Meshishi and Rashid Ghannouchi. Ghannouchi is Speaker of the Tunisian Parliament and head of the country's largest political party, Ennahda. Critics are calling President Said's move a coup. Said's administration has opened an investigation into 3 political parties. These include Ennahda. This is on suspicion of receiving foreign funds during the 2019 election campaign. Ghannouchi announced that his Ennahda party is trying to form a national front to counter the decisions recently taken by President Said. A top-level Taliban delegation visited China today. Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, the Taliban's co-founder, met with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Taliban representatives are in China for talks while they control their shared border. Beijing fears Afghanistan could be used as a staging ground for Uyghur separatists in Xinjiang. Taliban spokesman Mohammad Naeem told the AFP that those concerns were unfounded. He said the Islamic Emirate assured China that Afghanistan's soil will not be used against any country's security. Naeem also said that China promised them not to interfere in Afghanistan's affairs. The Taliban spokesman also stated that China is willing to help in the country's peace process. Beijing confirmed the gist of the talks, but Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani questions the Taliban's claim that they are seeking a political settlement. In a speech which started with the recitation of the Quran, he expressed his distrust of the group.
I offer the bridge to peace, to holding of early elections, and we stand by it. The Taliban and their supporters, however, by contrast, engaged in an all-out war and are determined to impose themselves by the judgment of the sword. The jihadi and radical networks and transnational terrorist and criminal organizations are fully mobilizing in support of their Taliban allies in return for future reciprocity.
President Ghani was addressing the Special Joint Coordination and Monitoring Board. Beijing hosted a Taliban delegation in 2019, but backdoor links with the insurgents existed before through Pakistan. Palestinians in the West Bank are resisting the takeover of their water source by Jewish settlers. The Ain al-Hilwa spring is a critical and strategic source of water in occupied Palestine. It is located between 2 Jewish settlements. Israeli settlers have been building a fence around the spring to take complete control of it and deny Palestinians access. Israel controls approximately 80% of water reserves in the occupied West Bank. Illegal Jewish settlers in occupied Palestine continue to control water sources, and Palestinians continue to protest. In these images, Israeli soldiers disperse Palestinian demonstrators protesting Israeli settlements. At least 6 Rohingya died Tuesday, and thousands have been relocated to other refugee camps in Bangladesh. The tragedy was a result of monsoon rains that triggered landslides and flash floods in the country's hilly settlements. 5 Rohingya, including 3 children, died after being crushed under their bamboo and tarp-made hut in Balukhali camp. Another Rohingya child died after he drowned in a stream in the nearby Palong Khali refugee camp. Nearly 1 million Rohingya live in overcrowded camps in Bangladesh's southeastern district of Cox's Bazar, which borders Burma. They fled genocide at the hands of Burma's military that intensified 4 years ago. This is the same military committing human rights violations against Burma's pro-democracy activists since a military coup in February this year. Rohingya settlements in Bangladesh remain at high risk during natural disasters. They are located on mud hills prone to landslides. Their bamboo and plastic-made huts cannot withstand monsoon rains. The material they are made from is also highly flammable. The NBA announced yesterday that former U.S. President Barack Obama has joined NBA Africa as a strategic partner. He will help advance the league's social responsibility efforts across the continent. These include programs and partnerships that support greater gender equality and economic inclusion. In this capacity, former President Obama will have a minority equity stake in the new venture. According to the NBA, he will use his stake to help fund the Obama Foundation. This is an educational nonprofit founded by the former president and his wife Michelle Obama in 2014. The former head of state intends to fund Obama Foundation youth and leadership programs across Africa. European women are taking a stand for modesty. In this report by Ali Khalaf and Saleha Farouk, you will hear about German gymnasts in Tokyo and French women in France.
European women in France, Germany, and Norway are taking a stand. Their stand is for their choice of modesty against the sexualization of women. They are getting mixed responses. The female Norwegian beach handball team was fined by the federation for not wearing bikinis. Many people supported their decision. However, American singer Pink offered to pay the fine. The German women's gymnastics team created a buzz with their wardrobe during the Tokyo Olympics. Female gymnasts are expected to dress in bikini cuts. The German gymnasts defied that expectation by wearing full-body unitards. They say they are against sexualization in gymnastics. Women have the right to choose their dress, they say. Tokyo and Germany are buzzing in support of their choice of modesty. Just next door in France, however, it is a different story. French police shut down a public pool because 6 women were swimming in a burkini. Police fined those women and banned them from the public pool. The burkini is a modest swimsuit preferred by many women. Even Nike launched a swimwear line that caters to Muslim and modest women. However, French secularism cannot tolerate that. They have banned burkinis in most French public pools and beaches. French women have been fighting for their right to choose their dress, mostly unfortunately and unsuccessfully. Nothing is new here, of course. Men keep fighting over how women should dress. One of these days, I hope that they will grow up.
Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment. So stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. United States President Joe Biden announced that American troops will end their combat duties in Iraq by the end of the year. To analyze this announcement, let's go to Saleha Farouk for a detailed analysis. Over to you, Saleha.
Thank you so much, as always. Today, we're very happy to be joined by Professor Stephen Zunes, who is a professor of politics as well as international studies at the University of San Francisco. Professor, thank you so much for your valuable time today.
Pleasure to be with you.
Now, of course, U.S. involvement in Iraq has been recalibrated for the first time in over 20 years, interestingly. Tell us about this new relationship between the U.S. and Iraq, which will primarily consist of various forms of support and resource sharing.
It's questionable how big a shift this is. Prime Minister Karimi has been under a lot of pressure about the continued presence of U.S. forces in Iraq 18 years after the U.S. invasion. And then the announcement has been that U.S. combat forces will be withdrawn. However, it appears that much of that will be just redesignating the troops that are already there, and there may not be much, if any, reduction in the 2,500 Americans in the U.S. Armed Forces that are currently stationed in Iraq. The continued presence, of course, has been quite controversial. The official explanation, of course, is that the United States there is to fight the remaining forces of Daesh along with their Iraqi partners. But also it appears that the U.S. is trying to keep a military presence to counter the influence of Iranian-backed militia, which also came to the fore following the rise of Daesh. And so it's and of course, the irony of it was that there was no Daesh and there were no pro-Iranian militia in Iraq until after the U.S. invasion. I mean, it is a direct result of that ill-fated decision. So it's unclear exactly what this means, more than perhaps just some political cover for the Iraqi prime minister.
Thank you for that insight. Now, President Joe Biden is seen here as taking perhaps a different strategy in his approach to U.S. presence in Iraq. What could this mean for the relationship between Iraq and the U.S.?
Well, the Iraqi government has been plagued by corruption, by sectarianism. Let's remember that when the U.S. overthrew Saddam Hussein, they did not just throw out the former dictator and his cronies, but they basically decimated the civil service. I mean, basically hollowed out all the ministries, and they ended up being fiefdoms of a certain narrow sectarian interests. And it's been really rife with corruption and ineptitude. It's been a real mess, and it's really, again, opened the door for the strong influence by these Iranian militia. It has exacerbated tensions between the Sunni and Shia communities. Now, it's important to note, though, that the biggest divisions in Iraq are not between Sunni and Shia, but between sectarians and nationalists within both communities. And the indeed, it's been these sectarian groups that have been responsible for much of the violence against civilians, including much of the killings of the growing civil society movement, the pro-democracy, anti-corruption struggle that emerged immediately prior to the pandemic. The question is the presence of U.S. forces preventing things from getting worse, or is it essentially goading on this kind of violence and extremism? I mean, ironically, it appears that a lot of the rationalization for U.S. forces is in force protection, kind of a secular logic that says we have to keep troops there to protect American troops. And the protection of American troops has included airstrikes against these pro-Iranian militias, some of which are actually officially part of the Iraqi armed forces, the government we're supposed to be supporting, which has led to the strong reaction by the Iraqi parliament and others against the U.S. presence there. So again, whether this decision by the Biden administration will actually make it safer for American forces, will enable some kind of stable government to consolidate power against both the threat from Daesh and these militias, whose loyalty appears to be more with the Iranian Ayatollahs than it does with the Iraqi government. It's really hard to say.
You do bring us to our next question, which is, do you think that insurgency groups such as ISIL will remain a threat to the region? And with U.S. troops pulling out of the region in terms of its combat mission, what does this mean for the people, for the Iraqi people on the ground? If we can just get into the implications for day-to-day civilians.
Well, Daesh no longer controls much in the way of territory as they did for a number of years. 5 or 6 years ago, but there's still a threat. There have been periodic terrorist bombings and the like, and U.S. forces who have some expertise in counterterrorism activities have been useful in certain ways in both the training and the implementation of these kinds of counterterrorism activities. But it also, again, raises the question, are the presence of foreign forces, especially those from the West, is this the kind of thing that essentially serves as a recruitment arm for these extremist groups? And just like all the other questions regarding this, again, does the presence of U.S. forces do more harm than good?
This decision coincides somewhat with American troops also leaving Afghanistan. What currently are the priorities of the United States defense institutions, and what kind of outlook can we expect here?
Well, for years, the United States has hoped for a shift in its strategic focus to East Asia. But events in the Middle East keep drawing attention and resources and personnel away from that priority to try to clean up the messes that the United States, unfortunately, played a role in creating in some cases. And so I think that it is, again, very much of a balancing act. I mean, what can the United States do? I mean, I think most Americans would be open to having troops in the Middle East, even having troops in harm's way if they really thought it would end up protecting American interests and saving civilian lives. But the history of the past 20 years seems to have been that the greater the U.S. presence, the more we've militarized the region. In fact, the less secure and the less stable the region has become. And we need to, I think, seriously reevaluate what it means about security and the role that U.S. armed forces can play in such regions as the Middle East.
You mentioned East Asia. Let's get into that a little bit. A lot of people are saying that scaling back U.S. presence in the Middle East allows for the administration to be able to deal with a bigger threat to national security, which in their view is from China and cybersecurity threats. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't think an increased troop presence in East Asia will make a difference one way or the other. But at the same time, I think that as the United States has become less dependent on Middle Eastern oil, as the record as resentment of the U.S. and its role in the Middle East remains very high, that I think the Pentagon and the White House, State Department are recognizing that it would be better to focus American energies in areas where they think that the U.S. presence can be more beneficial and more welcomed by the people of the region. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to have the potential of making some big mistakes in East Asia as well. The U.S. has a history of strategic blunders and other regions of the world besides the Middle East. But at the same time, I think there is a real recognition that the strategic focus of the United States does need to shift.
Thank you so much for that. And now, do you believe that foreign policy goals in those parts of the Middle East that we were discussing will be more achievable with the implementation of assistance and training by the U.S. military instead of having a traditional military presence?
Well, I think generally the lower the profile of American forces, the better. I still think there are a lot of Americans who don't quite realize the strong resentment by many peoples of the Middle East for our policy in that part of the world, from backing dictatorships to supporting the Israeli occupation to bombing campaigns, which ended up with civilian casualties and the general, frankly, imperialistic kind of policies the U.S. has waged. At the same time, there are legitimate security concerns. So, cooperation with the U.S. military is something that one can make an argument is a worthwhile endeavor. But again, the lower the profile, the less arrogant, the less prone for the U.S. to dictate things, I think the more effective a U.S. military presence would be.
We're here today with Stephen Zunes, who is a professor of politics and international studies at the University of San Francisco. Professor Stephen, thank you again for your time today.
Again, my pleasure.
Back to the news studio.
Thank you, Saliha. Before moving on to our next analysis, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back after these messages.
our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. In our show yesterday, we covered the news of United States House investigation into the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Let's go to Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid for a detailed analysis.
Thank you, Samana. A couple of things happened yesterday in Washington, D.C. At the Capitol, which was the scene of January 6th attacks, a hearing at the House began. And 4 officers described what they went through. There was something new for me. But yesterday also, 6 Republican congressmen, they marched in front of Department of Justice calling for the release of the people who attacked those officers. They were calling them political prisoners. Political prisoners. Let's hear from a historian who knows what goes on in America. Our guest is Scott Geck. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to be here.
Scott Geck is a professor at the Trinity College in Connecticut. So were you shocked to see officers being this emotional in their testimony?
It's always a very shocking thing to hear from participants who were directly engaged in the attack on the Capitol, or the defense of the Capitol, if you would, on January 6th. These officers obviously suffered a deeply traumatic event, which one would expect when one is the victim of violence. One certainly has a range of emotional responses over time. What hit me the most was when officers spoke of kind of their efforts to get members of the crowd, of the attackers, to see them as human, right? One of the officers, said, I have kids, right? Like trying to get them to say, hey, I'm a person. Don't kill me. And it's really hard. It's really hard then to pair that with the other event that you brought up, which is this kind of political spectacle that went on at the Department of Justice, where several Republican representatives, started talking about political prisoners and kind of government overreach. And that's kind of the crux of where we are at this moment with the January 6th Select Committee. Right, these kind of two competing narratives that are going on, and one comes largely from a Democratic side that talks about what Christopher Wray called DVE, right, domestic violent extremists. And back in September of 2020, Christopher Wray testified before a House committee and said perceptions of government overreach, racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, misogyny, and reactions to legislative action were kind of the main drivers of domestic violence extremism in the United States. And then, of course, we saw it in one version play out on January 6th.
Listening to one of them who mentioned, that I have kids, that he was unconscious. He went through heart attack during that period. Later on, he was informed. And so the personal trauma officers went through, although I watched quite a bit of videos and all that during that time, but that seems to be quite touching. I saw some of the congresspersons tearing up, although politicians are capable of drama, but there seems to be just genuine feeling in that room at that moment. Why those feelings have turned political?
It's an excellent question, right? And it seems that the officer's testimony, and again, these are law enforcement officers, typically a Republican, an issue where Republicans are particularly strong in supporting law enforcement. Here we're seeing that a collapse of that, because part of the Republican response has been that these were peaceful protesters who descended on the Capitol on January 6th. And these officers' testimony clearly describes something that is, quite violent. Officers, as you said, who were suffering heart attacks, who were, being beaten, suffering both emotional abuse and racism, but also physical assault. Being sprayed with a variety of different chemicals, being beaten, being threatened sometimes with their own weapons. There's it's difficult for an outsider to wrap your head around. I can only and I have seen some of the coverage around the world of how do you try to, one of the reasons we have this committee, right, is to make sense of, to find the truth. And one of the challenges of a democracy is that we pride ourselves, and should pride ourselves, on giving the quote unquote minority opinion on issues a voice. But when it comes to situations like this, where many of the constituents of the quote minority voice were participants in an attack on government, right? We're seeing a big tension in how the system is actually created and framed, right? How do you give space to a minority opinion that denies the truth of what happened on that day?
Now, Republicans chose not to have the voted against or make sure that it doesn't come to vote, the independent commission in which they will be equal participant. And this ended up being a Pelosi game, that she controls everything and Republicans cannot join and all that. So as a nation, it's neither a truth commission, nor it's a bipartisan commission. It is just one-sided thing. Do you think it will help our country?
I think it's always important to leave a record of the truth, to have the Capitol Police officers and other law enforcement agencies and members of those agencies leave a record of what they experienced on that day. We will also have a large, if you would, court record of those who have been arrested at this time. So yes, I do think it's quite important to have that record. How it gets framed as a political tool or weapon is kind of another aspect to it. But yeah, we need to leave that record. We need to have that testimony that we heard from yesterday, even if it doesn't help in the immediate sense in the next year. Hopefully down the road, again, hear me speaking as a historian, down the road, that record becomes, the basis for truthful telling of January 6th.
Do you think Republicans will regret not participating? Because now who's going to speak for Trump? Who's going to speak for Republicans, not those two Republicans who are Pelosi Republicans?
Right. It's an excellent that's an excellent question. They have voluntarily, if you would, removed their ability to make that record, and I would imagine, again, this is maybe more of a medium term effect, that at some point it's difficult to deny law officers experiences when they were physically attacked. And so I think they're playing, the Republicans are playing a dangerous game. And I think it's part of a conundrum that they have faced even heading into the last election, of taking extreme denial of truth and fact, and doing their best to change and shift a narrative that doesn't seem to be changeable to the degree that they want it to be changed.
Representative Cheney made it clear that testimony of those people around Trump is essential to get to the truth. Do you think we are looking ahead with some high drama in which Trump might walk in?
That's an interesting question. Certainly law officers yesterday identified, if not by name, by kind of by position, that one person, right, that the attackers constantly said that Trump had sent them, and the framing of that situation is there, right? Like, if they're looking to uncover truth and need to talk to as many people who are involved in this event as possible, then certainly it seems that just by the testimony yesterday that Trump is implicated in this and needs to offer testimony of some sort. It seems difficult, given the fact that he was a sitting president, at the time. It seems difficult to imagine that he would come in person to give testimony.
Scott, what is in the character of Liz Cheney that she's willing to risk her seat and positioning in the Republican Party to explore what is the truth?
I think hopefully in the long run, that her position with truth and fact finding will appeal to more moderate Republican voters, and that her courage in this situation, and it seems odd to talk about a truth teller as being particularly courageous in this particular event, in which the Capitol was attacked, and many of the individuals who are denying that the Capitol was attacked were sitting in the building at the time. But I would imagine she is going to position herself as the kind of independent, if I may borrow from John McCain's maverick type of voice within the Republican Party, and appeal to voters who align with that more independent streak. That's my understanding of where she is, and probably, and I would hope, right, she also feels this way, right, that there is a truth to be told.
Now, another step is taken in the direction of denying what happened. I mean, we all watched. I was sitting with my wife at the lunch table when I saw people being moved from the House chamber, and I told my wife something serious is happening here, before knowing anything would happen. I mean, so many people watch, but now another step is taking the area of denial, saying those people who attacked, actually they are political prisoners who are standing up for America. Has this threshold been crossed before?
Well, yes. Certainly one can think of secession and the American Civil War, where members, both political members of political parties and also members of Congress, stood up for what they believed was right and correct, and walked out of the Capitol building to align with governments, and then a government that would literally attack the federal government. So yes, this has happened before. It happens on smaller scales. One can think of Ammon Bundy and kind of protests against federal policy in Western lands in recent years. But in terms of actual politicians being on board and aligned, certainly 1861 to 1865 would be one of those moments.
It seems to me, Scott, that some of the vocabulary and some of the feeling is borrowed from the minorities, and a term political prisoner was not a term invented by majorities. Throughout the world, political prisoner of conscience, or the vocabulary of those people who are striving for more freedom and more things. So is the right-wing white supremacy reached the level that their psychology is essentially the psychology of minorities?
Well, they've certainly positioned themselves as such, right? White victimhood was certainly a keystone of President Trump's time in office and his campaign style, and that has resonated strongly through certain areas of the United States where white individuals feel threatened by measures to construct a more equal United States.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Gay.
Thank you.
Back to you, Samana.
Thank you so much. That's all from our Chicago studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Salam and good night.